funds and entitlement as well as discretionary grant monies to school districts. Basic aid is often referred to as equalization aid. Each jurisdiction's funding formula for basic aid is a compilation of laws passed over the years, and the formula evolves with mounting levels of complexity. During the 1900s, states distributed monies to school districts with a flat grant formula that provided a set per student dollar amount regardless of the district's fiscal capacity. North Carolina is the only state that employs a modified flat grant to distribute state basic aid today. In the 1920s, foundation models became popular in allocating state basic aid with the addition of a factor in the formula to address a district's fiscal capacity to raise local property tax. 32 states and the District of Columbia presently execute a modified foundation model. The full funding model, similar to the flat grant, emerged in 1930, with the state accepting full responsibility for school spending. During the 30s, states modified full funding formulas to address the costs associated with educating spatial populations, such as at-risk students. Hawaii currently exercises the full funding model. The power equalization model, popularized by the test case Serrano versus Priest, apportioned monies to equalize funding in correlation with a district's assessed property valuation. 7 states currently employ a modified power equalization model. 9 states use a hybrid of models to allocate state funds. Now let's examine elements from each model. The flat grant model distributes unrestricted state aid based on an equal per pupil subsidy established by the state legislature. In a conventional format, the formula divides the number of primary and secondary public school students in the state by the legislative appropriation. As you see in this illustration, the student average daily membership is divided into the total state allocation, which yields a per pupil state aid amount. This per pupil amount is applied to each district's average daily membership. To fund traditional public school districts, North Carolina employs a modified flat grant formula. The state formula then applies the designated average daily membership throughout the established allocations in 3 allotments: position, dollar, and categorical. This figure illustrates the state aid for Allegheny County schools with an average daily membership of 1,410 students, and the flat grant per allocation applies to each allocation. Notice this district received over $12.8 million of state basic aid. The conventional flat funding model appeals to policy leaders because this formula is easy to understand and simple to calculate. Currently, though, very few states, as we've mentioned, use this model. The equal subsidy set by educational components, such as the number of classroom teachers in relationship with the student headcount, appears to treat all districts fairly by allocating equal dollars for each student. In a full funding model, the state accepts complete responsibility for school funding. In this illustration, the formula divides the appropriated funding by the number of students in the state to arrive at a per pupil amount dispersed to districts throughout the state. Hawaii is the only state that funds its schools with a full funding model. State funds are sent directly to each school in the state as opposed to the district. In a full funding model, the state accepts complete responsibility for school funding and does not permit schools to collect local means. The classic full funding model also does not equalize factors related to a district's fiscal capacity nor local effort, although the traditional example may offer a few more dollars to property poor districts. Because districts in Hawaii cannot spend more than the amount legislated by the state, the modified full state funding structure provides the funding ceiling for schools, whereas the flat grant formula provides the funding floor with district dollars supplemented by local means. A conventional foundation model, in this model, the state delivers foundational funding which acts as basic or equalization aid. A three-step formula calculates the state's general foundation funding in a classic scheme. In step 1, the applied formula multiplies the full-time equivalent student enrollment by the legislatively set per pupil dollar amount. The formula in step 2 multiplies the district's aggregate property assessed valuation by the state-set local millage tax rate, establishing the district's local share. In step 3, the formula subtracts the general foundation aid from the local share to calculate the state's foundation basic aid. The West Virginia Public School Support Program, a modified foundation model, distributes state funding with a 10-step foundation formula to arrive at the state's basic aid for each school district. The annual state statutory set salary for each employee by classification and the employment experience schedule establishes the level funded by the state. In steps 1, 2, and 5, the net enrollment, the number of full-time students in grades pre-kindergarten through 12, with the ratio of employees per 1,000 authorized by the state, establishes the general foundation dollars in each category. Step 3 funds the employer's benefit costs through a statutorily set amount or percentage of the employee's salary. Step 4 funds transportation operating costs, including bus driver salaries, maintenance bus replacement, and contract services, based on the number of net enrollment students per square miles in the service county. Step 6 accounts for general operating costs, in other words, instructional programming materials, supplies, and equipment. Also, substitute employee costs and the faculty senate. Step 7 offers an allowance for instructional program improvement, technology, and advanced placement programs based on set variables. Step 8 sums steps 1 through 7. Step 9 subtracts each school district's local share, which is 90% of a district's aggregate taxable assessed valuation, multiplied by the levy millage rate determined by the state. There is a 4% reduction for uncollected taxes in the district. After tabulating steps 1 through 7 and subtracting the local share plus deductions, step 10 equals the state basic aid for each school district. Notice that Brooke County Schools, with its 2,935 full-time equivalent students, receives $11.6 million in state basic aid. The foundation program's intent is to equalize funding between property poor and property rich districts. In a foundation program, a property poor district with the same student enrollment as a property rich district obtains proportionately more state funding than the property rich district due to the calculated local share. Foundation programs possess several appealing aspects, including a structured formula that formally equalizes funding for students based on a district's fiscal capacity. Deducting a state-set local tax millage rate in the foundation formula intends to equalize funding between property poor and property rich districts. Foundation programs provide students in property poor school districts with a minimum education, which basically assists property poor districts to compete with property rich districts in terms of educational offerings. Because foundation programs by law allow districts to collect local tax above the foundation level, overall funding discrepancies can exist between per pupil spending in poor and rich property districts. On another note, jurisdictions typically do not establish an adequate budget allocation for the foundation program, and the set allotment increases very slowly over time. The power equalization model, based on per pupil assessed valuation, focuses on state assistance to equalize the school district's ability to raise revenue instead of establishing a minimum threshold of state financial support like the foundation model. The power equalization model has three conventional derivations: percentage equalization, guaranteed tax yield, and guaranteed tax base. A traditional guaranteed tax yield program ensures equal per pupil revenue based on equal tax effort by designating an average tax yield in the state. A conventional guaranteed tax base program does not necessarily specifically provide a minimum spending level, but provides all districts with access to a state guaranteed per pupil tax base, defined as the average assessed property valuation. For example, District A approves 10 mills, which garners $1,000 in local property tax, while 10 mills generates $5,000 of property tax in District B. When a state guarantees a $500,000 per pupil assessed valuation, but a district has a $100,000 per pupil tax base, like District A, the state matches dollars to reach the same state equalization aid as District B with a $500,000 per pupil tax base. As such, District A receives $4,000 in state aid per student, whereas District B does not receive any state funding. According to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction website, Marshall Public School District with 1,105 full-time equivalent students received $8.5 million in state basic aid. In Wisconsin's guaranteed tax formula, the primary funding tier ensures that state funds are available for most school districts, regardless of their assessed valuation. Marshall Public School District received a little over $914,000 in primary tier aid. For the secondary tier, the state guaranteed per pupil assessed valuation was lower, meaning that fewer wealthy school districts received state basic aid in this tier. Marshall Public School District, an average wealth district, received $6.6 million in secondary tier aid. The third tier has a much lower state guaranteed assessed valuation per pupil to ensure that high spending districts only receive third tier state basic aid when districts are property poor in assessed valuation. Marshall Public School District received $1 million in third tier state aid. Overall, Marshall Public Schools collected around $8.5 million in state equalization aid after subtracting charter school deductions and other formula adjustments. The power equalization model factors a district's fiscal capacity into the equalization equation, permitting property poor districts to receive more state aid than property rich districts with a similar number of students. The merits of power equalization are discernible in support of the taxpayer because the community voters and the school board determine the extent that local education funding may exceed state basic aid. With this structure, the state cannot escape its proportionate fiscal responsibility. To create an acceptable basic aid plan for a majority of constituents, policymakers often devise funding distribution methods that combine concepts from two or more models. Hybrid funding models attempt to synthesize the best ideas from other models by applying these factors into a single format. This diagram for the moderately wealthy Aransas Pass Independent School District in Texas with 1,534 full-time equivalent students received a little over $7 million in state basic aid. Texas's hybrid funding model employs concepts from both foundation and power equalization models in a two-tiered structure. The Tier 1 allotment, adjusted by geographical cost of education index and district size, bases funding on the average daily attendance of regular special education, vocational, bilingual, as well as gifted and talented students. Transportation, compulsory education, and specialized high school allotments are additionally included in Tier 1. As in a foundation model, Texas school districts are responsible for a portion of the entitlement. As such, districts must subtract revenue from their Tier 1 allocation through a local fund assessment at the determined state millage rate on local property tax. Tier 2 provides more dollars to school districts via the guaranteed yield approach. The state guarantees each district a minimum yield on each penny of local property tax collection using a combination of state basic aid and local revenue. When a property poor district raises as much revenue as the tax base allows, the district bolsters the Tier 2 yield up to the state guaranteed tax base. Districts with a moderate property wealth that raise more local funds receive less state basic aid. Very rich districts do not receive much, if any, Tier 2 state basic aid, and because these districts locally raise the entire guarantee. Opponents of Texas's hybrid model claim the system has created a Robin Hood effect on property-rich districts. A hybrid model uses concepts from various models in order to compromise stakeholders' views. Proponents assert that the hybrid system fails to provide districts with sufficient funding, produces disparities between poor and rich property school districts, and requires property poor districts to locally tax properties at a higher millage rate to provide a basic education than property rich districts. This model is hard to explain and understand for constituents.